V's. But here's what, Mr. George. I want to go through the process a little bit. And you being a former member of the Police Service Commission, you think that to members of the public, and you think that the Police Service Commission, and you think that other agencies would have done enough to make this process look to be fair and transparent? Because I think that, when this time comes around every few years, there is a sort of sigh. We have to go through this process again, and then there are clouds over the entire process. So again, you think that those in authority have done enough to remove these clouds as it relates to the fairness of this process and transparency?
Well, I think, Marlon, that certainly the Police Service Commission has a duty to explain to the public and to keep the public apprised of, their attempts to carry out a fully transparent and, thorough vetting process along the way. And I have not seen any evidence of that in the public space. And I'm not sure why. It appears that they prefer to, operate, almost as if they are locked away in an ivory tower somewhere, insulated and isolated from the common man. But we must always remember, even from, the 1936 Privy Council case of Ambad versus Attorney General, where the Privy Council had to say, that justice must not be a cloistered virtue. She must allow herself to be subjected to the respectful but searching scrutiny of ordinary men. So, in other words, even though, yes, you have a constitutional duty and a role, that is set out in the Constitution as, commissioners on the Police Service Commission, you owe the public a duty to ensure that that confidence resonates throughout the entirety of the process. So therefore, if it is that, you engaged in all these exercises of, because, from, when we were there, it was a very, very thorough process. Even from the medical screening, you had to ensure that, the candidates were, medically fit and sound. You had to do security vetting. You had to do, the oral, examination, the questions. You had to do, so many things in terms of ensuring that you got the best possible candidates for the job. And then now you produce a merit list, which is now supposed to rank the candidates in a certain order. So therefore, whoever tops the merit list would be, I guess, the first name that you would put forward. I haven't even seen any evidence, to suggest, well, look, the Police Service Commission has indicated, well, look, we do have this list and these are the others. Because remember, Marlon, there is no obligation upon the Parliament to accept even the top recommended choice. If you recall, in the past, we've had scenarios where the government has gone, they rejected number one, they rejected candidate number two, they rejected candidate number three, and then they chose candidate number four. So, the point is, we would have appreciated, I think, from the Police Service Commission, a lot more transparency, clarity, and explanation as to the due diligence and the process which attended upon this choice and selection that they made.
Mr. George, just what you have spoken about, there is always the feeling, and I know what the politicians are going to say, well, this process is free of the politics, but their history has shown, Mr. George, and I hope that you will bear me out on this, that it is always the government of the day that will get their choice as to who is the police commissioner.
Of course, it is. In fact, Marlon, if you recall, previously you had what was called the prime ministerial veto, whereby the prime minister had the ultimate say where he could veto the choice. So in other words, you have, somebody been recommended, and the Prime Minister could, of his own volition, he alone could decide, I don't want this person. If you recall, that occurred in the case of when Mr. Stephen Williams, when his name was put forth as commissioner, then Prime Minister Manning exercised his power of veto to not have him appointed as commissioner, right? Then we said, well, okay, that's not fair, so therefore the law was changed, and it then became the question of parliamentary majority. But that brings it exactly back to what you've said, Marlon. It really then comes down to, okay, parliamentary majority. Who has the parliamentary majority? It's the government of the day. So the government of the day will choose who they want. And that's really what it comes down to. So, I mean, as much as we like to, think that we have insulated and isolated the process from the ultimate political control, it really goes a whole big circle to come right back to a question of the government of the day having the say.
But you know what, Mr. George? I think that all candidates from time immemorial, they have had to bear the weight of being seen as being aligned to a particular party. So, again, history will show. And, it is something that comes up every time that this process comes up. So, whoever the candidate is, or the person who has been chosen as the police commissioner, they are viewed as being aligned to the particular party that is in government. Over the past few days, I had a conversation with a police commissioner, and we were speaking about that. And, I think that it sometimes gives the impression that a police commissioner has, he works in a silo and doesn't have to account to anyone. And I think that sometimes the politicians believe that here's what, if we choose this candidate or we choose this candidate, that the candidate is going to run roughshod over the entire system. And I don't think that is necessarily true. Speak to that to us.
Okay, well, the thing is, I mean, I think that in fairness to, past office holders, I think we've had quite a few examples of police commissioners who have demonstrated quite clearly their independence from the dictates or the control or the, persuasion of the government of the day. In fact, I think quite recently we would have seen where Gary Griffith as commissioner, in fact, he appeared in the latter days of his tenure to be completely at odds with the government of the day.
And we saw what happened.
And he wanted to basically run his own show, he exercised that level of independence, and I mean, we have seen it with, I think, a few other commissioners. So I'm not sure that we can say necessarily that office holders have been, beholden or have expressed that, view of, being or feeling that they are beholden to the government of the day. We've seen, sometimes investigations being launched against government ministers. I mean, if you recall, Franklin Kahn was investigated and charged as a government minister, Eric Williams as a government minister, So, I mean, I think that in fairness to the office holders, we have seen quite a few of them, display a robust level of independence of the feelings or the persuasions or the subtle whisperings of the government of the day. And I think that is what we want for Trinidad and Tobago, that you have a commissioner of police who really puts the interest of the nation of Trinidad and Tobago as his first priority, as opposed to, looking at any political hue or stripe or color or shade.
But how do you protect the independence of a police commissioner? We're speaking in a general sense here. How do you protect the independence of a police commissioner? How do you protect the independence of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service? And I put it in the context that when you do have a process such as this as to what is going to happen today, there's always the feeling that the politician has his hand or her hand somewhere and pulling the strings, and also the future of a police commissioner really depends on the yay or nay of the politician. So are you comfortable with the role that the politician is playing right now? Or do we as a country have to find a way to divorce the politics from the post of police commissioner?
Well, one way would be to move it beyond the simple majority that it is now, in the parliament. So in other words, if you require, say, for instance, a special majority, which would then involve having to get votes from the opposition members, then you may have, a more balanced approach to that selection process that takes place in the parliament. So that's one thing. But bear in mind another thing, Marlon. In terms of the officers who have been appointed on contract, okay, so let's look back at, say, for instance, Mr. Dwayne Gibbs and Mr. Iwatsky. They were appointed on contract. Now, that is where you really have the government of the day basically having that entire control over their careers and their tenures as commissioner and deputy commissioner. Because if you recall, when the government of the day, felt that they had enough of Mr. Gibbs and Mr. Iwatsky, they simply terminated their contracts. So therefore, once their contracts of employment were terminated, we at the Police Service Commission then had absolutely no choice but to then revoke their appointments as commissioner and deputy commissioner. So those officers who are on contract, so if you recall, even with the last sitting commissioner, Ms. Erla Christopher Harewood, remember she got the extension and therefore was on contract. So in those circumstances, the government of the day has that level of control, because they could say, well, look, either we renew you or we don't renew you or we terminate you. But in a scenario where you have an officer who is a tenured officer within the police service coming up through the ranks and being appointed, so therefore you are not on contract, I think there is a greater level of independence that that officer can display, because of the fact that he's not beholden to the contractual dictates of the government of the day. So maybe in this circumstance, we might see the opportunity for that level of independence of mind and thought in the office holder.
Is there a greater role, rather, you think, for the people of Trinidad and Tobago to play in this process? I think that something unfortunate would have happened over the past few days when the commission would have said, well, here's what. Senior Superintendent Alistair Guevara is at the top of the list. And I thought it was unfortunate, and the gentleman was really put in an uncomfortable position when people are asking, who? And I think that is very unfortunate and in some cases disappointing for the gentleman.
Well, I mean, of course, it would be in a circumstance like that. And you see, because of, I think, the lack of communication by the Police Service Commission along the way. So in other words, people didn't even know that he was a candidate, So, I mean, if it is that you had indicated, well, look, we are screening these persons, we are shortlisting them, and then you say, well, okay, right, as a result of the shortlist, we have 15 candidates who we will then, do the further round of investigation and interrogation to then create the merit list, and these are the 15 persons, because in fact, let me tell you, that level of, communication with the public is important, and I'll tell you why, Marlon. it's important for the public to be aware, because I'll tell you, while we were conducting these exercises, because of the fact that we displayed a level of transparency and we would let the public know who are the candidates who are even being chosen. And, we let the public know, well, look, we are going to embark on the exercise. In fact, in some cases, we even invited persons in the public, if there's anything, either in favor or against any of the candidates, please let us know, so that we can do a full and thorough investigation, because you certainly don't want to end up in a scenario where you appoint somebody and then you realize, well, look, there are some skeletons in their closet which nobody, had, known about, and then, it creates an embarrassing situation with egg on your face. And we actually received, things which we then had to investigate and interrogate and, call back candidates and say, well, listen, this is something serious. You need to give us some explanation for it. And Marlon, I'll tell you, there is actually judicial precedent for that type of, thorough interrogation and investigation. There's the Privy Council case, and it's actually out of Jamaica, but it is binding upon us because the Privy Council still remains our last and final court of appeal. The Privy Council case of Jamaicans for Justice versus the Jamaican Police Service Commission. In that scenario, the Jamaican Police Service Commission had received complaints about one of the candidates that they were seeking to appoint, in terms of, extrajudicial killings. And, they said, well, look, there's a trend with this officer. If you notice, every time he goes on a scenario, somebody is killed, So, of course, maybe he might end up being a hero in that sense. But then you look at the bigger picture. Is it that he is stepping outside the bounds of lawful authority, with this record of so many, extrajudicial killings? And the Police Service Commission in Jamaica conducted a very cursory investigation into the matter. And they said, well, but, we didn't see anything major. And they were moving forward with the process. But that group, they would not let it rest. They actually challenged it in court. They went to the High Court in Jamaica, they went to the Court of Appeal in Jamaica, they went to the Privy Council, and the Privy Council slammed the Jamaican Police Service Commission and said, no, you have a duty to fully and thoroughly investigate any complaint or anything which is, alleged or known against an officer whom you are seeking to appoint to these serious positions. And they ruled in favor of the group Jamaicans for Justice. So that judgment, I recommend it to our present Police Service Commission, that they get a copy of that judgment, that they read it and study it and understand the extent of the duty. So it's not just a question of you, huddling away in a corner and you saying, well, okay, all right, you roll the dice and you say, okay, we choose this like, you're choosing 3 blind mice. No, you are supposed to do a fully transparent process whereby you invite the widest possible scrutiny, comment, whether good or bad. Of course, you have to sift through, because you'll have persons who, for various reasons, malice or whatever, may make comments. But of course, you then discard those. But if it is that there is something serious in terms of some allegation or some thing that is proven against a candidate, then you have a duty to thoroughly investigate that and make sure that as part of your vetting and screening process, you weed that out. So therefore, going forward, you have basically a very sanitized list of candidates that comprise your merit list.
Yeah. Mr. George, I just have about a minute or two. What can we expect today?
Well, I would imagine that, the government would have already had their caucus and they would have decided whether they are happy with this candidate or not. As I say, I have not seen in the public space as yet a merit list, showing who is number 2 on the list, who is number 3 on the list, or the scores or anything of the sort, as I say, it really does not, do well for, public confidence by the Police Service Commission, acting in such a clandestine manner. They ought to have, come with a greater level of transparency so that persons in the public space could see and understand, well, okay, look, you have this list of 5 candidates, this one scored this among, this one scored that among, this one, or at least, even if you don't put the scores, you certainly put this one is ranked number 1, this one is ranked number 2. So therefore, you understand that if it is today, the government decides to reject the number 1 candidate, you will know who is at number 2, etc. So, I hope that we are able to get through this without some of the attendant litigation and the brouhahas which have occurred because we've seen so often in the past the Police Service Commission end up in an imbroglio that is rather unseemly, whereby persons either file actions and they say, well, look, you were not fair in this way, you did this, or you were not transparent enough. So I mean, it's just words of caution that I am, suggesting respectfully, as I say, and we should be guided by the law, and that's why I'm referring again to that case, Jamaicans for Justice versus the Jamaican Police Service Commission. It's really an excellent case and a guideline for all members of the Police Service Commission.
Yeah, and Mr. George, I'm going to steal one more minute again from my producer. But I'm just thinking, and I'm sure that people are going to say, because of what you would have said, you said, well, here's what. I'm sure that government would have already looked at the list and would have decided on its candidate, its choice. So again, doesn't that again speak about the process by the Police Service Commission? And what does it say about that process if it is that the government has already, and I can put it in as governments when it comes to the candidate for police commissioner, that they have already decided. So what about the process? Is that a wasted process?
Well, it goes back to the legislation, Marlon,
yes.
Because the legislation as it currently, you see, what we got, basically, we got a 649. When they said they are removing the prime ministerial veto, so they tried to make it appear, well, look, all right, okay, we're moving it so that, you don't have one person deciding it. But at the end of the day, you've moved it from that to the simple majority of the government of the day being able to choose. So it comes back to the question that the government gets their choice. And I think the only way we can, move it from that is either to remove the parliamentary, oversight, whereby the parliament has the final say totally, and you have just a totally independent body making the appointment, plain and simple. Or if it has to go to the parliament, you create a special majority which would necessarily involve the input of members of the opposition. So therefore you are able to balance the scales a little bit more. So in that regard, that's not the fault of the Police Service Commission. They are constrained by the legislation that they have to act with and work with. So if we want to change that, you're talking legislative change, you're talking constitutional change, because remember, the Police Service Commission falls under the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah, Martin George, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We do appreciate your perspective, sir. Bye for now.
Thank you. Have a great day.